1 week before my wedding, I stood frozen in the hallway of my parents' mansion in Connecticut, my hand pressed against the polished oak doorframe, my breath caught in my throat. Through the narrow gap, I heard my younger sister Lila whisper to her friend, her voice dripping with malice. "I'll rip her dress apart during the toast," she hissed. My heart slammed so hard it hurt. My wedding dress. My day. My dignity. She was planning to destroy it in front of everyone I loved, in front of 200 guests, and she wasn't even trying to hide her glee. I wanted to rush and scream, expose her right there, but instead I stayed still, my face cold, my body rigid as stone. My sister's laughter was sharp, cruel, echoing down the marble hallway like the sound of glass shattering. I realized in that instant that she wanted me broken, humiliated, small. But instead of tears, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I even smiled just slightly and reached into my clutch. My hand found my phone, and with one call I would change everything. I pulled back quietly, the echo of her voice still cutting through me. The mansion, with its high ceilings and chandelier glow, had never felt like home. It was a cage lined with expensive curtains and polished floors where favoritism thrived like a family heirloom. Lila had always been the golden child, the jewel my parents displayed at every holiday dinner, every Christmas gathering, every company gala. And me, I was the shadow. Excluded from conversations, forgotten in photos, reduced to a side note in the family story. As I walked down the hall, I thought about the years of being overlooked. Christmas mornings when Lila unwrapped diamond bracelets while I got socks. Birthdays when my cake was a grocery store, leftover with a single candle, while hers came with tiers of buttercream roses and guests flown in from New York. Every memory cut deeper when I realized my parents weren't blind, they chose to see her and not me. That night, the pain I carried was no longer pain. It was fuel. I descended the grand staircase slowly, my heels clicking against marble, and past the family portraits that lined the walls. Every frame told the same story: Lila, smiling in her prom gown, Lila, holding a trophy, Lila in Paris, with our parents beaming beside her. My presence in those portraits was either cropped at the edge or missing entirely. It was as though I had been erased from my own family's narrative. By the time I reached the bottom, my phone was already in my hand. I scrolled quickly, my thumb steady, despite the storm raging inside me, and found the number I needed. Clara Hayes. She wasn't family, but she was more trustworthy than anyone who shared my blood. A world-class event planner I had once worked with quietly through my company, Clara, understood precision, timing, and spectacle. I pressed call. "Rachel." Her voice was brisk, professional. "I need you," I said softly, keeping my tone flat, controlled, not just as a planner, as an ally. There was a pause, then her voice lowered. "Tell me." I glanced back up at the staircase, the weight of the mansion pressing down on me. "My sister is planning to humiliate me at my wedding. She wants to rip my dress in front of everyone. And my parents, they're in on it too," Clara exhaled sharply. "That's not just cruel, that's war." Exactly, war. The word I hadn't dared to use but felt in every vein of my body. As I left the hall and stepped outside into the cool night air, I could still hear Lila's laughter echoing faintly inside. The garden lights glowed across the lawn, casting shadows on the fountain where she and I once played as children. I remembered the day I pushed her on the swing, only to have her run crying to our parents, accusing me of shoving her to the ground. I'd been grounded for a week. She had smiled behind their backs, smug in her victory. Favoritism, manipulation, toxic family. Words that once felt too dramatic to describe my life now fit perfectly. I finally had proof. Clara's voice cut into my thoughts. "What do you want me to do?" I lifted my chin, the cold breeze stinging my cheeks. "I want her plan to backfire. I want them all to see the truth. Not tomorrow, not someday on my wedding day." For the first time in years, I felt control shift in my favor. I ended the call and tucked my phone away, knowing Clara would set things in motion. Then I turned back toward the glowing windows of the mansion, where laughter spilled out like poison. Lila thought she had me cornered. My parents thought I would take the humiliation like I always had, silent and small. But this time I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to smile. And I was going to make sure the world watched as their cruelty collapsed on itself. That night, lying awake in my childhood bedroom, I stared at the ceiling and let memory after memory roll over me. Thanksgiving dinners where my father carved the turkey with Lila at his side, ignoring me. Summer vacations where my mother took her shopping while I stayed home. Business conversations where they praised her intelligence and dismissed my ideas. Injustice had lived in my blood for 29 years, a wound that never closed. But no more. The chandelier's reflections sparkled faintly on the ceiling like stars. I whispered into the dark, tomorrow everything changes. And for the first time I believed it. The dining room glowed with the false warmth of candlelight, the silverware catching every flicker as if mocking me. I slipped into my seat at the long mahogany table opposite my sister, and immediately felt the weight of exclusion settle around me like a heavy coat. My parents were mid-conversation, their voices animated as they asked Lila about her new fashion line. "It's launching in Los Angeles next spring," she said, her smile perfect, her tone rehearsed. "A collaboration with a luxury house. Everyone's already calling it the next big thing." My mother clasped her hands together in admiration. "Darling, that's magnificent. You've always had such flair." "Haven't I said since you were a little girl you were born to shine?" My father raised his glass of Bordeaux. To Lila, the pride of this family. They all drank. I lifted my water glass, the chill biting my fingers, and sipped silently. Not one question about me. Not a word about my job, my life, my upcoming wedding. My presence was an afterthought, a placeholder at the table meant only to balance the symmetry of the chairs. "Rachel," my mother finally said, as though remembering, "your work at that little office is still going." "Yes." Her voice was light, dismissive. "Yes," I said evenly. "Still going." "Good," she replied, already turning back to Lila. "But Rachel, really, you should be grateful your sister is the one bringing prestige to the family name. Not everyone can be extraordinary." The words landed like stones in my stomach. I cut a piece of roasted chicken, chewing slowly, letting the bitterness settle. Lila caught my eye and smirked, as if daring me to speak up. Instead, I lowered my gaze to my plate. Not because I was weak, but because I knew silence could cut sharper than any argument. As the meal went on, their favoritism only grew louder. My father asked Lila about Paris Fashion Week. My mother described the mansion's new renovations, all for Lila's future. They planned out her triumphs as if she were a queen ascending a throne. And I sat there, the forgotten daughter, excluded from the narrative yet again. The clink of cutlery reminded me of every past holiday where this same theater played out. Christmas mornings when Lila tore open velvet boxes while I unwrapped socks with a price tag still attached. Birthdays when my cake came from a grocery store shelf while hers was a custom confection with sparklers and photographers. Even Thanksgiving dinners when she carved the turkey with our father while I passed the bread invisible. Injustice had been stitched into my childhood like an ugly seam. Tonight it pulsed brighter when my father leaned back, swirling his wine, and said casually, "Your mother and I have been finalizing the will." The room seemed to freeze. My chest tightened. "The estate, of course, and the company shares," he continued. "They'll go to Lila. She has the talent and the discipline to keep everything thriving. Rachel, well, we'll make sure you're comfortable. But let's be honest, you've never shown much drive for business." My fork scraped against the plate. I swallowed, the burn rising in my throat. Comfortable, that was their word for me. They were giving her the mansion, the family business, the inheritance. And me, a pat on the head and a consolation prize. Lila leaned forward, eyes glinting. "Don't worry, Rachel. I'll take good care of it all. You can always visit me here after the wedding." The table erupted in laughter. My father chuckled. My mother dabbed at her lips with her napkin, smiling, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to humiliate me in my own home. I forced my lips into a polite curve. My chest burned, but I didn't let it show. After dinner, when the plates had been cleared, and my parents lingered over coffee, Lila leaned closer, her voice pitched so only I could hear. "What's your dress made of?" Again polyester. I looked at her calmly. "Silk," I said. She chuckled. "From the discount rack, maybe." Her laugh was sharp and ugly. My mother smiled as though it were a charming joke. My father sipped his coffee without a word, tacit approval in the silence. It was then that I felt a gentle touch on my arm. My grandmother Eleanor had moved her chair closer. Her voice was soft but steady as she whispered, "They think they've broken you, but you frighten them more than you know." I turned to her, startled. Her eyes, clear and bright despite her age, held mine with certainty. "They fear you," she said, "because you don't need them." Her words sank deep into me, filling the cracks carved by years of neglect. My throat tightened, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was from something fiercer, something like resolve. Later, I retreated to my old bedroom upstairs, the one still painted pale blue with faded posters peeling at the edges. I closed the door quietly, the distant laughter from downstairs seeping through the floorboards. Their laughter had always been my prison, but tonight it was different. I sat at the desk, opened my laptop, and slid a USB drive into the port. The screen flickered to life, the glow illuminating my face. I entered the string of encrypted characters, only I knew the gateway into the life they had never acknowledged. Email notifications blinked across the screenboard, updates, financial reports, pending contracts worth millions. They thought I was nothing but an office clerk, but here in this hidden corner of my life, I was the CEO they never imagined I could be. I leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. My reflection in the laptop screen stared back at me stronger than I'd ever seen. If they wanted to humiliate me, to strip me down until there was nothing left, then they were about to learn the lesson they'd spent their lives ignoring. I closed the laptop and whispered to the empty room. If they want a show, I'll give them one. The shadows stretched across the ceiling, silent witnesses to my vow. I slid the USB drive back into its case, tucked it into the drawer, and smiled to myself. Tomorrow, the planning would begin. Tomorrow, revenge would no longer be a fantasy, it would be a strategy. And for once, I wasn't afraid. I was ready. By day, I was nothing more than a mid-level employee in a nondescript office building on Main Street. People saw me carrying coffee, shuffling papers, answering emails. They thought I was harmless, ordinary, even invisible. But when I came home at night, locked the door to my Boston apartment, and opened my laptop with its secure logins and encrypted files, I stepped into my true life, the life no one in my family knew about. I was the CEO of a growing financial data firm with contracts spanning London, Singapore, and Dubai. Investors respected me. Analysts feared my precision. Competitors whispered my name with envy, but to my parents and to Lila, I was still the disappointment, the sister who'd never measure up. That night after leaving the mansion, I sat in my dimly lit living room, the glow from the screen painting my face in pale blue light. An email pinged at the top of my inbox. Urgent final signature required for $18M expansion contract. I read it twice, my heart steady. This wasn't just business. This was validation. They could ignore me all they wanted, but out here in the world I'd built myself, I was undeniable. My phone buzzed on the table. Clara Hayes. I picked it up at once. "Rachel?" she asked, her voice sharp, efficient, the kind of tone that made billionaires fall in line. "It's me," I said, leaning back into the couch. "The wedding isn't just under threat, it's under siege. My sister's plan goes beyond childish jealousy. She wants a spectacle." "What exactly is she planning?" "She intends to rip my dress during the toast. My parents are helping her, and they've prepared a slideshow to humiliate me." Silence hummed on the other end, then Clara said, "Then we'll turn her theater into yours." Her certainty made me smile. Tell me how, I whispered. Your dress will be 2 parts. We'll design an outer shell meant to rip on command. But underneath, we'll hide a second gown, magnificent, dazzling, unshakable. When she pulls that thread, expecting shame, the room will erupt with awe. I closed my eyes, imagining it. The fabric falling away, the gasps, the applause. For once the laughter wouldn't be at me, it would be at her. There's more, Clara added. If they've planned a slideshow, we'll override it. I'll bring in David Tran, he owes me favors. He's a genius with audio-visual setups. We'll hijack the projector. Replace it with what I asked, though the answer was already forming in my mind. With the truth, Clara said simply. I felt the words settle deep into my bones. The truth. Something my family had always buried under lies, favoritism, and manipulation. We talked for nearly an hour, sketching outlines of a plan that was more like a battle strategy than a wedding rehearsal. By the time I hung up, my resolve was steel. Yet even steel can shake when old ghosts appear. Later that night, I received a text message that made my stomach drop. It was from Nora, a college friend who had once been close to Lila before they fell out. Saw Ethan with Lila tonight. He's helping her. Something about taking your company down too. Be careful. My throat tightened. Ethan Price. He was once my business partner before greed devoured him. When I caught him skimming profits and tried to cut ties quietly, he threatened lawsuits, slander, even sabotage. I'd managed to shut him out legally, but I knew his bitterness still festered. And now, of course, he had found the perfect ally, my sister. The thought of them together plotting not only my humiliation, but also the destruction of everything I'd built, made my hands curl into fists. I opened my encrypted files again, scrolling through reports, contracts, confidential data. Ethan had always been dangerous because he knew just enough to cause chaos. If he could convince Lila and my parents that I was a fraud, they'd have more ammunition. Worse, if he leaked anything to the media, my entire reputation could collapse. But he had underestimated one thing. I was not the same woman he had once tried to manipulate. I sat at my desk until nearly dawn, drafting countermeasures, organizing proof of my ownership, my authority, my success. I cataloged evidence of Ethan's embezzlement from years ago, enough to sink him if he tried anything public. And I saved it all into a folder labeled simply, for war. The next morning, I drove to a cafe on the edge of town where Clara had set up shop. She looked immaculate as always, sleek hair, red lipstick, a clipboard in hand. You look like you haven't slept, she said, sliding me a latte. I haven't, I admitted, but I have everything we need. She leaned closer, eyes gleaming. Then so do I. On the table between us, she spread sketches of my dress, a gown within a gown. She showed me fabric samples that glittered under the cafe's dim lights. When the outer layer falls, it'll be like a star exploding. No one will ever forget it. I touched the silk cool under my fingers and smiled. Perfect. We were interrupted when my phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from an unknown number. If you think you're untouchable, think again. By the time your wedding ends, you'll lose more than your dignity. You'll lose your company. My pulse spiked, but I forced my face calm. Clara leaned forward. What is it, just Ethan, I said, shoving the phone into my bag. He thinks threats will scare me. He's wrong, she smirked. Then let's give him a front row seat to his own downfall. By afternoon, we had David on a video call. He appeared in a cluttered studio, wires and screens behind him. Hijacking a slideshow, he said with a grin. Child's play. Send me the files and the timing and I'll set up a trigger system. One click and their little prank becomes your masterpiece. As we talked logistics, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their cruelty. I was orchestrating my own justice. That night, standing before the mirror in my apartment, I unclasped the silver necklace I always wore. On its pendant was the logo of my company, my true life, my hidden empire. I held it in my palm and whispered, if they want humiliation, they'll get it, just not mine. I placed it carefully back around my neck, meeting my own eyes in the glass. They had underestimated me for years. They thought silence meant surrender. They thought exclusion meant weakness. But they were about to learn what it truly meant when the tables turned. And this time I would not be the one on my knees. I would be the one standing tall, smiling while they crumbled. The war had begun. The morning light filtered weakly through the heavy curtains of my apartment, but I was already at the kitchen table. Coffee untouched, my notebook spread open like a battlefield map. Lines and arrows traced across the page, connecting names to motives, linking lies to actions. At the center, circled twice, was one word: wedding. Around it, I had drawn the players in my family's little drama. Father with his prepared speech to belittle me. Mother with her slideshow of humiliation. Lila with her thread meant to tear my gown, and Ethan lurking in the background planning to poison my business. Looking at it, I felt less like a bride and more like a general planning for war. My phone buzzed. Grandma Eleanor's name lit up the screen. I answered immediately. "Rachel," she said, her voice carrying the steady weight of a woman who had lived through decades of secrets. "I've been thinking about what you told me. You're not wrong to prepare yourself. You can't trust them." "They're my parents," I whispered, though the word felt sour. "They're people who envy you," she corrected, "and envy makes family more dangerous than strangers." Her words sank into me like stones dropped in deep water. "Do you know something?" I asked cautiously. There was a pause, then Eleanor said, "Your mother wasn't always the favorite. When she was younger, she betrayed her own sister for a man. It ruined their relationship forever. It's a pattern in this family, Rachel. Betrayal runs deep here. And now they are repeating it with you." I gripped the phone tighter. A hidden truth I had never known, another layer to the toxic roots of this family tree. "I won't let it end with me," I said finally. "That's why I'm with you," she said. "Whatever you need, I'll help." When we hung up, I felt a spark of courage. If they wanted me erased, then I would carve myself into the stone of this family, with proof, with evidence, with justice. I dialed another number. James Calder, my lawyer. We met later that afternoon in the quiet corner of the downtown law library, surrounded by towering shelves and hushed voices. James wore his usual gray suit, glasses perched low on his nose, eyes sharp with curiosity. "I've got recordings," I said, sliding a small device across the table. "They're planning to humiliate me in public. My sister, my parents, even Ethan Price." James played a snippet. Lila's voice filled the silence. "I'll rip her dress apart during the toast." His lips tightened. "That's deliberate harm. You could sue for emotional damages, defamation, if it's broadcast, even intentional infliction of distress." I nodded. "If they follow through, I want them cornered legally, as well as socially." James leaned back. "Then keep collecting proof. You'll need more. And remember, don't confront them until you're ready to burn the bridge entirely." I left the library with determination surging through me. That night, I slipped back into the mansion under the pretense of picking up wedding details. While my parents chatted in the parlor, I moved quietly to the dining room, attaching a small recorder beneath the table. The next morning, the device gave me exactly what I needed. My father's voice rehearsing lines, meant to embarrass me, my mother listing photos of my childhood mishaps to display. Each word became a nail in the coffin they were building for themselves. Later, Clara called me with updates. "The seamstress finished the alterations," she said. "The outer dress will rip easily, but the gown underneath, Rachel, it's stunning. Think of light captured in fabric. When that moment happens, no one will remember her cruelty. They'll only remember your transformation." I closed my eyes and imagined the scene. Lila pulling the string, the gasp of fabric tearing, then the reveal, a gown shimmering like fire under the chandeliers. My humiliation turned into my triumph. "Perfect," I whispered, but my relief was short-lived. That evening, Daniel called. My older brother, who had left home years ago, sounded tired, but his voice carried an edge I hadn't heard before. "I heard you're back at the mansion," he said. "I am," I replied cautiously. "Be careful. Dad is preparing documents. He's moving assets." The inheritance, the company shares the estate, it's all being shifted toward Lila. You're being cut out entirely. The words landed like ice. Even knowing their favoritism, hearing it confirmed, twisted something sharp in my chest. Are you sure I saw the drafts myself? He's naming her as the sole heir to the family business. He says you'll be taken care of in other ways. The same phrase again. Comfortable, taken care of. Never equal, never enough. Thank you for telling me, I said, Rachel Daniel added softly. I walked away from them for a reason. If you fight back, I'll stand by you. It was the first time in years I felt like I wasn't alone among my siblings, but my enemies weren't resting. The next day, during a fitting at a high-end boutique, Lila strolled in, uninvited, wearing a white designer gown that shimmered under the lights. She twirled in front of the mirrors, ignoring the staff's uneasy glances. Oops, she said innocently. White's not just for brides, is it? I look better in it anyway. The seamstress flushed, murmuring apologies, but Lila only laughed. Rachel, I hope you didn't spend too much on your dress. Hate for you to look cheap on your big day. I clenched my jaw but smiled anyway. Let her think she had won this round. She'd already played her hand. That evening I got another call, this time from Nora. Her voice was urgent. Rachel, I don't know how to say this, but I overheard Lila and Ethan at a bar. They're planning to hire a photographer to capture everything, the ripped dress, your reaction, and post it online instantly. They want it to go viral. For a moment, bile rose in my throat. Public humiliation wasn't enough. They wanted digital ruin, a scandal that would follow me forever. Thank you, Nora, I said, steadying my breath. Don't worry, they'll regret it. When I returned to the mansion that night, my father pressed me to sign papers, granting Lila access to some of the wedding funds. It's simpler this way, he said, his smile tight. I placed the pen on the table, looked him in the eye, and said calmly, No. He blinked in surprise. Rachel, don't be difficult. I pushed the papers back across the polished wood. This wedding is mine, not hers. And you won't get another signature from me. His jaw tightened. My mother looked displeased, as though I had just broken etiquette at dinner, but for once I felt no guilt. Later in my bedroom, I opened my laptop and slid the silver USB into place. Every recording, every document, every photo, they were all here, safe and waiting. I closed the folder and tucked the drive into a case, the metal cool against my palm. This is my weapon, I whispered, and I won't hesitate to use it. I slipped the USB into my purse, zipped it shut, and looked at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were steady, sharper than ever before. They thought I was still the forgotten daughter, the quiet shadow. But now I was the storm coming to sweep their house of lies away. And I was ready. The law library still smelled faintly of dust and leather when I met James again, the early morning light slanting across the polished tables. He adjusted his glasses as I slid a stack of papers across to him. Recordings, I said, and I want them preserved. He leaned forward, pressing play on the small recorder. My father's voice spilled into the air. I'll list her failures. The guests should know the truth about Rachel. James's jaw tightened. Then came my mother's laughter, followed by Lila's triumphant hiss. She won't survive this. I'll tear that gown to shreds. James switched it off. Rachel, this is more than family pettiness. This is calculated humiliation. I'll draft preemptive filings for fraud and defamation. If they follow through, we can strike immediately. I nodded, feeling my pulse steady. I'm not letting them win this time. Later, when the mansion emptied for the afternoon, I returned and retrieved the recorder. Every word, every sneer was etched into digital proof, now tucked safely in my bag. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a weapon that wasn't just my silence. That evening, I met Daniel in a cafe outside Hartford. He was older now, lines around his eyes, but his presence was grounding. He stirred his coffee slowly before speaking. Dad's not hiding it anymore. The inheritance is set. Lila gets nearly everything. The business, the estate, even Grandma's trust fund. The words hit hard, but I'd braced myself. I always knew they'd cut me out, I said quietly. Daniel leaned closer, lowering his voice. But it's worse. They're moving things around so fast it could ruin the company. And Lila, she has no idea how to manage it. Or maybe she does, I said bitterly, because Ethan's helping her. His head snapped up. Ethan, that snake. He's back, I confirmed, and he's planning to drag me down with her. Daniel exhaled sharply. Rachel, if you want to fight, I'll testify. I left because I couldn't stand their favoritism, but I won't stand by and watch them destroy you. It was the first time in years my brother had chosen me over them, and it gave me strength. The next day, at my final dress fitting, I found Lila waiting in the boutique, parading in a shimmering white gown of her own. The staff whispered nervously as she twirled before the mirrors, her diamonds flashing. Do you like it? She asked sweetly. It's a shame, really, people might mistake me for the bride. But don't worry, Rachel, you'll have your moment. I forced a calm smile. Everyone remembers the bride, I said softly, not the imposter. Her lips tightened. She turned sharply, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she left the boutique in silence. That night, my phone rang. Nora again, her voice shaky. Rachel, you need to know this. I overheard them at the club, Lila and Ethan. They've hired a photographer to capture the whole thing. The ripped dress, your reaction. They want it online before the night is over. My fingers curled around the phone. They want to go viral with my humiliation. Yes, Nora whispered. They want to ruin you everywhere. I thanked her and hung up, my stomach twisting. This wasn't just about family drama anymore. This was about public destruction, digital shame, and my entire reputation. But instead of fear, I felt something colder, resolve. That evening during dinner at the mansion, my father slid a stack of papers toward me. Sign these, he ordered smoothly. It's a transfer of funds. Lila will manage the wedding budget. It will be simpler this way. I looked down at the documents, then pushed them back across the table. No, he blinked. Rachel, don't be difficult. This wedding belongs to me, I said firmly. Not to her, not to you. My mother sighed dramatically. Why must you always make things harder? I leaned back in my chair, letting silence do the work. The tension at the table was thick enough to choke on, but I didn't waver. When I returned to my room that night, I locked the door, pulled the silver USB from my bag, and set it on the desk. One by one, I added everything I had collected, recordings of their plans, photos of the inheritance drafts Daniel had shown me, even Ethan's threatening messages. On the screen, the folder gleamed like a loaded weapon. I whispered to the shadows, "This will be my bullet if they push me far enough." I slipped the USB into its metal case and tucked it deep inside my purse. The weight of it felt reassuring against my palm. They thought I was defenseless. They thought they could cut me out of the will, erase me from the family business, strip me of dignity in front of 200 guests. But what they didn't realize was that every cruel word, every manipulative trick, every injustice they tried to bury was now evidence in my hands. And when the time came, I would use it. I stood before the mirror, meeting my own eyes. For years, I had seen myself as they saw me, weak, invisible, excluded. But tonight, I saw something different. I saw a woman sharpening herself like a blade. Let them try, I whispered to my reflection. When they pull the trigger, they'll realize I've been loading the gun all along. And with that, I smiled, because I knew their downfall had already begun. Clara's studio smelled of fabric and coffee when I walked in, bolts of silk stacked like quiet trophies against the walls. She was already at the cutting table, blueprints of the dress spread out like battle plans. David sat in the corner, fingers tapping a laptop, a tangle of wires snaking around his chair like a nervous animal. The room hummed with the kind of focus I hadn't felt since closing a major deal, only now the contract was revenge. Good, Clara said without looking up. You're on time. She handed me a swatch of the outer fabric, light, vulnerable, threaded to tear at a touch. Underneath, she propped a panel of the inner gown, heavier silk, embedded with crystal points that would catch the chandeliers and throw light like a promise. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel. I ran my fingers over it and imagined the gasp the room would make when Lila's plan became the very thing that made them stare in wonder. David clicked through his setup on the laptop. "I can override the slideshow," he said. "I'll install a trigger linked to the seam pull. When the outer layer drops, the projector goes to my feed. That's when you see what I've stitched into the presentation." He didn't sound smug, just clinical, like a surgeon describing the cut he was about to make. Clara smiled. "We'll choreograph it so the pull looks like sabotage. It'll be exactly what they want, only the reveal will be theirs to regret." I felt a small laugh bubble up, but it was more like air escaping a lung. "Good," I said. "And the timing perfect," David said. "We practice once at the venue, then we roll." We did not speak of Ethan in that room, but he hung over the conversation like a storm cloud. He was the dangerous variable, the man who had once raked through company accounts for crumbs, and who had every motive to burn my reputation down. If he could find a hook to my business, he would. If he could leak a document, he would. That's why I'd called James. James arrived mid-afternoon, tidier and more composed than any weapon I'd ever needed. He unfolded my recordings onto the table like a prosecutor unveiling an indictment. He listened, nodding at the cadence of voices, the cruelty tucked between jokes. "This is deliberate," he said finally. "This is a plan to inflict emotional harm in public. You have grounds to go civil, and I'll prepare criminal referrals if we need to escalate. But the one thing the law can't do is give you the immediate vindication of a room that sees the truth as it happens. I wanted immediate vindication. I wanted the whole family, that mansion with its portrait-lined halls, the parents who treated favoritism like family tradition, to feel the sting of their own theater." James looked at me, his gaze steady. "The moment you reveal these recordings and the inheritance plans, you remove their power to manipulate. But we must be precise. If you move too early, they'll pivot. If you move too late, the footage goes viral and they claim it's falsified. Precision. Timing. Evidence." The words settled like armor around me. That evening, Grandma Eleanor appeared with a wooden cigar box that smelled faintly of cedar. She set it on the table between us and opened it to reveal brittle documents bound with string, old contracts, canceled checks, letters, with names and dates that rewove the family history into a different tapestry. "I kept these for years," she said. "I was ashamed of what I knew. But shame is a luxury we can't afford when others use lies to build legacies." Inside the box were papers that showed my father had diverted company funds to cover debts incurred in Lila's early ventures, and a wire transfer confirming a series of loans that were never repaid. There was a ledger entry with my grandmother's name as a silent investor in a company, my company, long before anyone else suspected. The ledger showed she had fronted capital quietly for me, a secret patron, until I used it to launch the firm that now hummed across continents. "You are angry?" Eleanor asked, watching my face. "Good. Anger makes us precise. I thought of inheritance of wills drafted to hand a mansion and a business to the favored child while treating me like a footnote. These documents were more than ink. They were an inheritance of truth I could use to reclaim a future. They were proof that my family had been building a fiction, favoritism dressed as fate." David set up a rehearsal at the venue that night. The mansion, usually a place that held my smallest humiliations, felt different in the dark, empty chairs, like blank witnesses, chandeliers, cold and expectant. Clara walked me slowly through the movements, how I would stand where Matthew would place his hand, the precise moment my father's toast would peak and Lila would make her move. Each step was practiced until it felt inevitable rather than staged. It was almost cinematic, and I allowed myself the small indulgence of imagining the audience's surprise, their sudden reorientation when spectacle turned into revelation. Mid-rehearsal, I received an email forwarded by Daniel, my brother, containing drafts of new transfer documents, the ones my father had been assembling to make Lila the primary heir of the family business. The drafts listed her name in black ink over the corporate shares. It was cold, calculated, final. My chest tightened. Daniel had circled a clause and added a note. This is legally dodgy. We need to freeze the transfers if possible. He concluded, I'll stand with you in court if needed. Allies were gathering in my orbit quietly with the kind of resolve that did not require fanfare. Clara had the spectacle. David had the tech. James had the law. Daniel had inside access and the moral restitution of a son who walked away. Eleanor had history and proof. Together it felt like a net tightening around the truth. That night I sat up late reviewing all the pieces, recordings, ledger entries from Eleanor's box, the drafts Daniel had scanned. I compiled them into folders and backed them up in multiple places. I printed a copy for James, another for Daniel, and left one discreetly in Clara's possession. The USB, the one holding the audio, the emails, the evidence of Ethan's machinations felt heavier in my palm than it had any right to be. It was not just data. It was the culmination of years of being dismissed and the instrument of a future they hadn't considered. Before bed, Eleanor took my hands and pressed the small pendant she'd given me years ago into my palm, the family crest worn smooth by decades. You must remember, she said, revenge without truth is noise. Revenge with truth is justice. I slept fitfully, full of plans and a curious, quiet peace. The network of friends and professionals I'd assembled had moved beyond loyalty into a kind of practiced ferocity. We were ready to turn their manipulation into a confrontation that would hold in front of any judge or the court of public opinion. When I finally locked the front door of my apartment, USB tucked safely into my purse, I didn't feel like a victim preparing for war. I felt like someone who had finally chosen to be the author of her own story. The gown would rip, the slideshow would play, but the narrative wouldn't end with me reduced to a punchline. It would end with them hearing themselves with their own voices testifying against them. It would end with the inheritance conspiracy exposed, with the family business's dirty little secrets scattered in the light. And when the world watched, the tables would turn coldly, precisely, and without mercy. The mansion shimmered under strings of golden lights as cars lined the circular drive, guests in evening gowns and tuxedos arriving for the rehearsal dinner. Inside, the dining hall buzzed with laughter and clinking glasses, but every smile felt brittle, stretched too thin. I stood near the entryway, my dress simple, a muted shade that let me slip into the background. Tomorrow the spectacle would be mine. Tonight I let them believe they held all the power. Lila swept into the room in a gown that could have been mistaken for bridal silk, hugging every curve, sequins, catching the chandelier light like 1,000 little spotlights trained only on her. Guests gasped as if she were the one being celebrated. She tilted her chin, accepting the admiration as her due. When she caught my eye across the room, she raised her glass in a mocking salute. I held her gaze, offering only the faintest smile, my heart, a still pond hiding its storms. My father rose, glass in hand. To Lila, he announced proudly, though it was supposed to be my night. She continues to carry this family's name with grace and brilliance. Truly a daughter anyone would envy. An applause scattered across the tables. My mother dabbed her eyes with a napkin, her gaze brimming with pride for her youngest. Then, as if remembering me, my father added, "And of course, best wishes to Rachel for tomorrow's ceremony." His tone was flat, perfunctory. The room laughed politely, and I swallowed down the familiar sting. Excluded again, even on the eve of my own wedding. "Don't do anything to embarrass us tomorrow," my mother whispered sharply as she leaned across the table toward me. Her perfume was cloying, suffocating. "We've worked too hard to see you ruin this." I didn't respond. Silence had always been their excuse to dismiss me. But tomorrow, silence would be my weapon. Later, as dessert was served, I slipped away from the main table and drifted down the hall, following the low hum of voices. Through the slightly ajar door of the study, I heard them, Lila and Ethan. "She'll never recover," Ethan murmured, his voice like poison poured into glass. "Once the video goes live, no one will hire her, no investor will touch her company. Her little empire will crumble." Lila laughed, high and sharp. "First the dress, then the slideshow, and now the video. She'll be a joke before the cake is even cut." I stood frozen in the hallway, every word etching itself into me like a knife, carving deeper and deeper. I lifted my phone, pressed record, and captured the evidence. Their voices, their conspiracy, their arrogance. Proof. My pulse raced as I stepped back silently. This wasn't just sabotage, it was annihilation. They wanted to erase me not only from the family, but from the life I'd built in secret. Let them try, I whispered, under my breath. When I returned to the dining room, Matthew was waiting, his eyes searching my face. He caught my hand, squeezing it gently. "You're pale," he said. "What's going on?" For a moment I wanted to spill it all, to tell him the depth of their betrayal. But I bit it back. "Tomorrow," I said softly. "Trust me, tomorrow." He studied me, worry clouding his features, but he didn't press further. His trust was both a gift and a weight. Grandma Eleanor found me just before the evening ended. She placed a small velvet box in my hand, her wrinkled fingers curling mine around it. "Open it tomorrow," she whispered. I nodded, the warmth of her presence grounding me as the night closed in. When the guests dispersed and the lights dimmed, I slipped upstairs to the old room that never truly belonged to me. I sat on the edge of the bed, the velvet box on my lap, and opened it carefully. Inside lay a necklace of deep green emeralds, the kind that shimmered with secrets of centuries past. "It belonged to your great-grandmother Eleanor," said softly from the doorway. "She was erased by this family too, her name written out of records. But she fought back in her own way. Tomorrow wear this. It will remind you you carry more than their dismissal. You carry a lineage of strength." My throat tightened as I clasped the necklace around my neck, the cool stones pressing against my skin. "Thank you," I whispered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the echo of laughter still lingering in the walls. Every holiday replayed in my mind: Christmas mornings where my gifts were an afterthought, Thanksgiving dinners where my seat was pushed to the far corner, birthdays forgotten until Lila arrived with fanfare. Years of injustice lined up like soldiers in the dark, but this time I would not be the silent casualty. I rose, padded across the room, and powered up my laptop. The screen's glow illuminated the silver USB drive on the desk. I plugged it in and opened the folder: recordings of my parents, the inheritance drafts. Daniel had slipped me Ethan's threats, and now tonight's audio of their new plot. Layer upon layer of truth stacked neatly, waiting. I pressed play on the clip I'd just recorded. Lila's laugh filled the room again. She'll be a joke before the cake is even cut. I hit stop. My reflection on the screen showed not fear but fire. I drafted one final message to Clara: Plan B needed. They're going digital. Be ready. Her reply came almost instantly: consider it handled. I shut the laptop and sat back, the emerald necklace cool against my skin, the USB warm in my palm. My family thought they were clever, thought their manipulation would end me. But every step they took was another brick in the gallows they were building for themselves. Tomorrow the lights would shine, the music would swell, and I would walk down that aisle with all of their lies hanging by a single thread. And when it snapped, it would not be me who fell, it would be them. The morning sun spilled across the ocean, painting the sky with streaks of rose and gold as I stepped out of the car and onto the gravel path leading to the seaside mansion. The air was cool, salted by the wind, and for a brief moment, it almost felt like any bride's perfect day. Guests were already gathering, their laughter drifting from the grand entrance where ushers welcomed them with glasses of champagne. But beneath the music and chatter, I felt the thrum of something sharper, like a violin string pulled too tight, ready to snap. Inside, the venue glittered. White roses lined the aisle. Candles flickered along the windowsills, and a quartet rehearsed quietly in the corner, their notes floating like fragile glass bubbles. The chandeliers above sparkled with a brilliance that seemed to mock the darkness I carried within me. Every detail was polished to perfection, every corner a stage, and I knew exactly what kind of performance was about to unfold. I slipped into the bridal suite where the gown Clara had masterminded waited on its dress form. The outer layer hung light and innocent, the kind of fabric meant to tear with a tug. Beneath it, the inner gown shimmered with hidden fire, thousands of Swarovski crystals, stitched with precision, each bead ready to blaze under the chandelier's spotlight. My fingers lingered over the fabric. "This was not just a dress, it was armor," breathed Clara said from behind me. She had arrived earlier, clipboard in hand, her hair tied in its usual sleek knot. She adjusted the hem and checked the seams one last time. The plan is flawless. Even if she yanks harder than expected, the reveal will be beautiful. I nodded, my heart steady in my chest. Good, because she will yank. Clara glanced at me, lips curved. "And when she does, it won't be you who's exposed." David poked his head in from the hall, a headset hanging around his neck. "All systems ready. Slideshow is rigged. The projector listens to me, not to them. One click, and their big reveal becomes yours." "Perfect," I whispered. Matthew appeared then, his tie still loose, his face warm with concern. He stepped close, cupping my hands. "You've been carrying something heavy. I can see it. Do you want to tell me now?" I shook my head gently. "Tomorrow, you'll understand everything. Just trust me." He studied me for a moment, then kissed my forehead. "Always." After he left, I sank into the chair before the mirror, the emerald necklace Eleanor had given me cool against my collarbone. Its weight reminded me of her words. "You carry more than their dismissal. You carry strength." Soon it was time. The coordinator tapped gently on the door. 10 minutes. I rose, Clara fastening the gown around me with quick, sure hands. David gave me a thumbs up before disappearing back to the booth. I walked to the edge of the suite and peered through the curtain into the hall. Guests filled the rows, a ripple of pastel dresses and dark suits. Phones already flashed as they captured every moment. I could see my parents in the front row, faces glowing with anticipation, though not for me, for the show they believed was about to unfold. And Lila, oh Lila, she sat smugly beside them, her lips painted crimson, her eyes glinting with cruel delight. She looked at me across the room and tilted her glass in mock salute, just as she had at the rehearsal dinner. I smiled back this time, not with fear, but with certainty. The music began, a swelling cascade of strings. The guests rose, murmurs quieting as the doors swung open. I stepped forward, Matthew at my side, my bouquet trembling slightly in my hand, not from nerves, but from the weight of everything converging on this moment. Every injustice, every slight, every Christmas morning where I'd been forgotten, every birthday where I'd been invisible. It all burned behind my eyes, not as pain, but as power. We walked slowly down the aisle, candles flickering in our wake, eyes following us with curiosity and admiration. The emeralds at my throat caught the light, glowing like green fire. Each step echoed louder, not in the hall, but in the story I was writing for myself. When we reached the altar, Matthew squeezed my hand. The minister smiled, but his voice was distant. All I could hear was the pulse of anticipation. From the corner of my vision, I saw Lila rise, her champagne glass catching the light. My father adjusted his papers. My mother tapped her phone, signaling the slideshow to the technician who thought he was in control. The storm was seconds away. I drew in a deep breath, lifting my chin. I was no longer the excluded daughter, the shadow in family portraits. Today, in this hall, under this roof of chandeliers and lies, I was something else. The violin swelled. Lila's lips curved. And as I stood there, the entire room holding its breath, I whispered silently to myself, "This is the day they fall." The clinking of glasses echoed through the hall as my father stood with his wine, raised his voice, booming with false warmth. "Rachel has always been spirited," he began, pausing just long enough for the laughter to ripple across the tables. "A little clumsy, a little slow with success, but tonight we hope she finally found her place." A few guests chuckled politely, though some glanced at me with sympathy. I kept my smile steady, my fingers brushing the cool emeralds at my throat. He went on, rehearsed lines rolling out like barbs disguised as jokes. My mother leaned toward the technician, signaling for the slideshow. The lights dimmed slightly as the projector hummed to life, waiting for its cue. The room grew expectant, unaware of the trap waiting to spring. Then came the toast. Lila glided forward, her crimson lips, curved champagne flute raised. To my dearest sister she cooed, who's finally found a man brave enough to stand by her side. May he have patience, he'll need it. Laughter cracked around the hall, sharper, this time crueler. I felt Matthew stiffen beside me, his grip tightening on my hand. I lifted my own glass, but before it touched my lips, Lila made her move. With a flourish so quick it looked rehearsed, she bent forward, pretending to adjust the hem of my gown. Her fingers hooked the hidden thread at my hip and yanked. The sound of fabric tearing sliced the air like a blade. Gasps erupted across the room. A woman shrieked. Glasses tipped over, spilling champagne onto white tablecloths. All eyes turned to me, waiting for the horror, the embarrassment, the collapse. But humiliation never came. The outer gown fell away in a single perfect sweep, the silk crumpling to the floor in a dramatic wave, and beneath it, the second dress blazed to life. Crystals caught the chandelier's light and scattered it into 1,000 stars, rippling across the hall. The gown hugged me like fire, shimmering with every breath I took. The silence was absolute for half a heartbeat. Then the applause began. First a murmur, then a wave, until the hall was roaring with cheers. Guests rose to their feet, some clapping, some whistling, some clutching their chests in astonishment. I stood tall, chin lifted, and smiled, not at them but at Lila, whose face had drained of all color. Her hand still clutched, the dangling thread trembling, caught in the act of her own undoing. "Thank you, Lila," I said sweetly, my voice, carrying across the microphone left carelessly on the podium. What a perfect way to unveil the real gown. Laughter erupted, not cruel at me, but at her. Cameras flashed, capturing not my shame but her frozen, horrified expression. The humiliation she had planned had turned on its axis, crushing her beneath it. Matthew leaned close, his lips brushing my ear. "You're magnificent." I squeezed his hand, steady as stone. Lila stumbled backward, stammering. That wasn't supposed. But the applause drowned her out. Wave after wave of praise showering me, each clap another nail in the coffin of her scheme. My mother's face was pale, her hand frozen mid-gesture toward the projector. My father's jaw worked, but no words came. I lifted my glass finally and let the hall quiet enough to hear me. "To family," I said, my tone sharp but even. "May we always be reminded that the truth will shine brighter than lies." The guests roared again, some nodding, some exchanging knowing looks. I caught sight of Grandma Eleanor in the front row, her eyes glistening with tears, her hands folded as if in prayer. She nodded once at me, slow and certain. David from the booth caught my gaze and gave the smallest signal. The next act was ready, but I let the moment breathe. I wanted them to soak in it, to taste the reversal. Lila had tried to strip me down, to expose me. Instead, she had become the joke, the petty sister left clutching tatters at my feet while I glittered like the bride I was meant to be. The humiliation was hers now, irreversible, undeniable. As I turned to face the hall again, raising my glass higher, I felt the emeralds at my throat catch the light, reflecting green fire into the room. The air seemed to hold its breath around me. This, I thought, is only the beginning. I sipped the champagne slowly, deliberately, and smiled as the music swelled again, the applause echoing like thunder. The trap had sprung, the tables had turned. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one trembling. It was Lila. My mother rose from her chair, her smile thin and sharp, the microphone trembling in her hand. "And now," she announced, her voice cutting through the applause that still lingered from the dress reveal, "let's take a look at Rachel's journey." The lights dimmed. Guests shifted in their seats, expecting childhood bloopers and awkward photos. I could hear a few stifled chuckles already, their laughter prepared to spill. My mother pressed her phone, signaling the technician. The projector flickered to life. But instead of baby pictures, Lila's voice filled the speakers. Clear, cold, venomous, I'll rip her dress apart during the toast. She'll never live it down." A ripple of confusion swept the hall. Guests leaned forward. My mother froze, her smile stiffening as the recording played on. First the dress, then the slideshow. "She'll be nothing but a joke before the night is over," a gasp broke out. Someone whispered, "Is that—" Lila heads turned sharply toward her. Lila shot up from her chair, shaking her head violently. No, this is fake." But the projector cut to the next clip. My father's voice this time. "She's never had the discipline. The will is set for Lila. The estate, the business, Rachel doesn't need those things. She'll be comfortable." The word hung in the air like a noose. Comfortable. The same word that had burned in my chest at dinner. The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs. "The will," one guest exclaimed. "They cut her out of everything." I kept my expression calm, even as my mother's face drained of color. The screen shifted again. Ethan's laugh echoed oily and triumphant. "I'll help Lila ruin her. She thinks she's untouchable, but once that video goes live, her company's finished. By tomorrow morning, she'll have nothing." There was no mistaking his voice. A man in the second row shot to his feet. "Isn't that Ethan Price? The one accused of fraud last year?" Gasps rippled again. From the back of the hall, James stood holding a file. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're hearing are authenticated recordings," he said firmly, his voice commanding. "Every statement is backed by evidence, and if necessary, this documentation will be submitted to a judge." The hall hushed instantly. Lila's voice cracked through the silence. "This is a trick. She's manipulating you all." But then the screen shifted to video. Grainy footage from a bar captured by a phone, Lila and Ethan leaning close, glasses in hand. "She's pathetic," Ethan sneered. "Wait until the dress rips and I'll make sure the photos go viral," Lila interrupted, smirking. "Rachel will be the laughingstock of the internet." The video ended with her laugh, shrill and unmistakable. The hall exploded. People were on their feet, some shouting, others filming on their phones. A woman near the aisle muttered, "That's disgusting." On her wedding day, another shook her head. "I can't believe her own sister." Lila's face crumpled. "It's edited. It's all fake," she screamed, but no one believed her. My father's fists clenched, his gaze darting around desperately, but he found no allies in the crowd. My mother pressed a hand to her forehead, eyes darting to the exits. I stepped forward, my heels striking the marble floor, the microphone cool in my hand. For years I said, my voice steady, though my heart thundered, I've been their shadow. Excluded, belittled, treated as less, and tonight they wanted to turn my wedding into my shame. But instead, you see the truth. This is who they are. The hall burst into applause again, louder, angrier this time, not for me, but against them. In the front row, Eleanor rose slowly, her cane tapping the floor. "I've kept quiet long enough," she said, her voice quivering but fierce. "Rachel built her company with her own hands. What none of you knew is that I invested in her from the start. She is the rightful heir to this family's strength, not the spoiled child you've witnessed here tonight." Her words struck like a gavel. Guests clapped, some even shouting agreement. Cameras flashed, capturing Eleanor's proud figure standing beside me. I felt my throat tighten, tears threatening, but I held them back. I wanted clarity, not weakness. James raised the file higher. "Evidence of financial misconduct, inheritance, manipulation, and collusion with a known fraudster is here. If any of you doubt what you've seen tonight, the courts will confirm it." The projector shut off. The lights brightened. And in that harsh illumination, my parents and Lila looked exposed in a way no ripped gown could ever achieve. Matthew took my hand and raised it high, his voice steady as he declared, "This is my wife, and nothing will tear her down." The hall erupted one final time, thunderous applause echoing to the rafters. Lila collapsed back into her chair, trembling. My father muttered something under his breath, inaudible, his face gray. My mother stared at me with eyes that no longer held contempt, only fear. And me, I stood taller, the crystals of my gown blazing under the chandeliers, the emeralds at my throat burning like fire. I looked straight at them, my family, and smiled. This I said softly, but every microphone carried it to the farthest corner is what happens when the tables turn. The hall erupted into chaos the moment the last clip faded into silence. Guests rose to their feet, voices overlapping in shock, some recording with their phones, others muttering angrily at the spectacle they'd just witnessed. My father's face was gray, my mother's hands trembled as she fumbled with her pearls, and Lila sat frozen, her lipstick smudged from where she'd bitten her lip too hard. The power they had wielded over me for years evaporated in seconds, leaving only their shame on display. James stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying over the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is evidence of conspiracy and attempted fraud. If necessary, this will go before a judge." He lifted the folder in his hands, the legal documents visible even from the second row. The murmurs fell into silence. The guests, donors, family, friends, business associates stared at my parents with newfound disgust. Grandma Eleanor rose from her seat, leaning on her cane, her voice clear despite her years. "I stayed silent too long, but not tonight. Rachel is the one who built something real. I invested in her company, not Lila. She is the rightful heir to strength in this family, not the spoiled child who tried to destroy her." Applause broke out, scattered at first, then swelling as more guests joined in. Tears stung my eyes, but I held them back. I wanted this to be remembered, not as my collapse, but as my rise. Lila shot to her feet, her chair clattering to the floor. "You're all blind. She's tricked you. She's manipulating you, just like she always has," but her voice cracked, trembling. Guests turned their cameras on her, capturing every frantic word. One man sneered openly. "Funny, the only manipulation we've seen tonight came from your mouth. My father tried to salvage control." He raised his hands, his tone falsely soothing. "This is a misunderstanding. Family matters are complex." A woman in the crowd cut him off. "Complex? You just admitted on tape that you cut your own daughter out of the will and estate." Another guest shouted, "You should be ashamed." My mother stood finally, her face pale as she stammered, "Please, everyone sit down. This isn't what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like. The doors to the hall opened then, and the sight of uniformed police officers sent another wave of gasps through the crowd. Two officers stepped forward, their expressions unreadable. Behind them was James, steady as stone. "Ethan Price," one officer announced, scanning the room. Ethan, who had been trying to slip toward the exit, froze as the crowd parted to expose him. The officer continued, "You are under arrest for fraud and attempted sabotage of a registered corporation." Gasps echoed as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He shouted protests, his voice rising, but no one rushed to defend him. Guests filmed every second, their cameras flashing like courtroom spotlights. The second officer turned to my father. "Mr. Morgan, we'll need you to come with us for questioning regarding financial irregularities." The blood drained from his face. My mother clutched his arm, crying out, "This is outrageous. You can't just." But Eleanor cut her off, her voice ringing like a verdict. "It's justice. You sow lies, you reap ruin." The crowd erupted again, some cheering, some jeering. As my father was led away, his shoulders hunched, his dignity shredded. My mother stumbled after him, ignored by the very people she'd tried to impress. And then there was Lila, left standing alone. Cameras pointed at her like weapons. She stammered, her eyes darting from one face to another, searching for anyone to take her side. No one did. Even her closest friends sat with folded arms, disgust written across their faces. "You'll regret this," she screamed at me, her voice breaking. "You think you've won, but you're nothing. You'll always be nothing." I stepped forward, my microphone steady in my hand, my voice calm but firm. "No, Lila. Tonight proves I was never nothing. Tonight proves I am more than you ever allowed me to be." The applause that followed was deafening, rolling like thunder through the hall. Matthew took my hand, then lifting it high in solidarity. "This is my wife," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "And nothing will ever tear her down." The crowd rose a standing ovation now, the hall shaking with claps and cheers. Lila collapsed into her chair, covering her face with her hands, sobbing, as the cameras recorded every second of her downfall. When the noise finally ebbed, I stepped to the center of the stage. My gown blazed with light, the crystals shimmering like fire, the emerald necklace glowing at my throat. I looked out over the sea of faces, the same people who once ignored me at family events, now watching with awe. "For years I was their shadow," I said, my voice carrying. "Excluded, dismissed, belittled. But shadows don't disappear, they grow stronger in silence. Tonight you've seen the truth. And the truth is brighter than any lie they tried to tell." The ovation rose again, so loud it rattled the glasses on the tables. When the officers escorted Ethan and my father out, and my mother stumbled after them, the hall seemed to breathe differently. The tension was gone. The poison had drained. And for the first time in my life, I stood not as the forgotten daughter, but as the woman who had turned humiliation into victory. The tables had turned and they would never turn back. The hall was quieter now, though the energy still pulsed in the air like the echo of a storm. Guests lingered at their tables, whispering to each other, eyes darting between me and the doors, where my parents Lila and Ethan had been led out. The chandeliers glowed warmly again, casting light not on my humiliation but on my triumph. I stood on the marble floor, Matthew's hands steady in mine. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a shadow in my family's house. I felt like the Sunday. Grandma Eleanor made her way toward me, her cane clicking softly against the floor. When she reached me, she placed her hand over mine, and Matthew's, her eyes shining with tears. "You did it, Rachel," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "You didn't just survive them, you showed everyone who you are." I swallowed hard, my chest tight with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you," I said. "You gave me the strength to fight." She smiled, the kind of smile that felt like a benediction. "Strength was always inside you. I only reminded you where to look." The guests around us began clapping again, but this time the sound wasn't explosive. It was steady, rhythmic, supportive. It wasn't about spectacle anymore. It was about respect. Matthew guided me back toward the altar, the minister still waiting patiently, his book open in his hands. "Shall we continue?" he asked gently, as if the entire storm that had just torn through the hall was nothing more than a passing cloud. I laughed, a real laugh, light and unburdened. "Yes," I said. "Let's continue." The ceremony resumed, quieter but more meaningful than I ever imagined. When Matthew slipped the ring onto my finger, the applause rose again, this time, pure, filled with joy rather than shock. When we kissed, I felt the weight of years lifting off me. For once my life was not defined by their betrayal, but by my choice, my love, my future. Afterward, as the reception began, I stepped out onto the balcony, overlooking the ocean. The night air was cool, the waves crashing against the rocks below. The emerald necklace Eleanor had given me gleamed softly against my skin, a reminder of the strength she had passed down. Matthew joined me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "I've never been prouder of you," he whispered. I leaned back against him. "For the first time, I'm proud of me too." We stood there in silence for a moment, watching the horizon where the moonlight danced across the water. Then I turned to him, my eyes fierce. They thought they could define me. They thought they could take my dignity, my future, my company. But they were wrong. I decide who I am. I always did. Inside, the music started again, and the sound of guests laughing and celebrating drifted out into the night. Not one person asked about Lila or my parents. They were no longer the center of the story. I was. When I returned to the hall, the dance floor was full. Clara caught my eye and raised her glass from across the room, a conspiratorial smile playing on her lips. David gave me a subtle salute from the booth, his headset still around his neck. James sat calmly at a table, sipping wine as if he hadn't just orchestrated the legal noose around my family's schemes. My allies, my chosen family, were here, and I wasn't alone anymore. I walked toward Eleanor, who sat watching the festivities with a small content smile. I bent down and kissed her cheek. "Thank you, Grandma, for everything." She squeezed my hand. "The tables have turned, Rachel. Let them stay that way." Her words wrapped around me like a blessing. As the night carried on, I danced with Matthew, with Eleanor, even with Daniel when he appeared quietly at the edge of the crowd. My brother's eyes held regret but also relief. "You did what I never could," he murmured as we danced. "You stood up to them." "You left," I said gently. "That was standing up too. Maybe now we can rebuild something on our terms, not theirs." He nodded, his expression softening. "I'd like that." The evening blurred into laughter, music, and freedom. For once, the joy in the room was mine to claim, not borrowed or overshadowed. When the final song faded and the guests began to leave, I slipped away to the balcony again, the night breeze brushing against my face. I thought about the girl. I used to be the one who cried into her pillow after every Christmas where she'd been overlooked, the one who sat at the edge of birthday dinners like a stranger in her own family, the one who believed she would never matter. She was gone. In her place stood a woman who had faced betrayal, humiliation, and injustice, and turned it into triumph. I turned back toward the emptying hall, feeling the emerald necklace against my skin, the crystals of my gown still glowing faintly under the fading lights. This was my closure. This was my justice. And as I walked back inside, I thought of the people who might one day hear my story. People who had been dismissed, belittled, excluded by their own blood. People waiting for a moment to remind themselves they weren't powerless. If you've ever been silenced, I thought you know what it means to find your voice. If you've ever been told you're not enough, you know the fire it takes to rise. I turned to the last few guests, smiled, and raised my glass. "To truth," I said softly. "To justice. And to never letting anyone write your story for you." The guests clapped warmly, and in that moment I felt whole. So, if you're listening to this now, I want to ask you, have you ever had to stand against your own family or those who thought they could break you? What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear your stories. And if you want more tales of revenge, justice, and tables turning, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Because the fight for dignity never ends, and together we can keep telling these stories until every forgotten voice is finally heard.